When LDS members are coming to your door, they're eager to talk to you about Joseph Smith and how great he is, and how he's got a new revelation and restored the church. But I bet you they don't tell you about the history behind the seer stone and the divining rods and his time in prison and things of that nature. Well, I'm going to dive into some of that stuff here. So we're going to start with Alma 37:23. It says, "And the Lord said, I will prepare unto my servant Gesem a stone which shall shine forth in darkness unto light, that I may discover unto my people who serve me, that I may discover unto them the works of their brethren, ye their secret works, their works of darkness, and their wickedness and their abominations." So here the individual is going to get a stone, and we know from the Doctrine and Covenants, chapter 78, verse 9, it says, "Or in other words, let my servant Newell K. Whitney, my servant Joseph Smith Jr., and my servant Sidney Rigdon sit in council with the saints which are in Zion." So here, of course, the individual getting the stone is, of course, Joseph Smith. But like I said, the LDS don't tell you the history behind the stone. The first individual who will help us understand the backstory behind the seer stone is the father-in-law of Joseph Smith, Isaac Hale. In his affidavit in March 20th, 1834, he says, "Smith stated to me that he had given up what he called glass looking," which is the idea of sticking your head in a hat and looking for money for individuals. It says, "and that he expected to work hard for a living and was willing to do so. He also made arrangements with my son Alva Hale to go to Plymouth and move his Smith's furniture to this place. Soon after this, I was informed they had brought a wonderful book of plates down with them. The manner in which he pretended to read and interpret," did you notice that? The father didn't buy this story. It said it was the same as when he looked for the money diggers with the stone in his hat and his hat over his face, while the book of the plates were at the same time hidden in the woods. So the father-in-law is calling foul right now. He's not buying this story. He thinks it's a load of rubbish, and I'm inclined to believe him. But we're going to continue on to see what else we find. Now, of course, you're going to see what David Whitmer says with regards to how the Book of Mormon was translated, according to an address to all believers, page 12. He says, "I will now give you a description of the manner in which the Book of Mormon was translated. Joseph Smith would put the seer stone into a hat and put his face in the hat, drawing it closely around his face to exclude the light, and in the darkness the spiritual light would shine. A piece of something resembling parchment would appear, and on that appeared the writing. One character at a time would appear, and under it was the interpretation in English." So honestly, he didn't have to do nothing. He just had to wait there, or he had to wait there for the English to show up. That's not really how you translate. You actually have to have skill with what you're doing. And there's no prophet in the Bible who has to stick their head in a hat in order to wait and see what the translation is, or the word from the Lord. Because typically, in the Old Testament, it would come, the word of the Lord came to, pick a prophet. The word of the Lord would come to the individual. They wouldn't have to degrade themselves and stick their head in a hat in order to get the revelation. And the father-in-law is calling, he's waving a red flag here, because he's saying the same stuff that Joseph Smith's pulling on the Mormons in order to translate the Book of Mormon is the same stuff he was doing before he ever came and was called as a prophet, because he uses the same method in order to find money for individuals. Let's continue on. We can see now the testimony of Emma Smith, the wife of the prophet. It says, "In writing for your father, I frequently wrote day after day, often sitting at the table close by him, he sitting with his face buried in his hat, with the stone in it, and dictating hour after hour with nothing between us." Did you notice there's a bracketed word there, and they inserted the word seer into this to make it more religiously acceptable, because Emma's affidavit her testimony only has the word stone, and the Mormons want to insert the words in order to make it fit with the narrative they're trying to craft here. But why would you need to doctor up the testimony of the wife of the man who you claim started your religion if you guys are all up to snuff. Well, no, apparently you're not, because you're even doctoring this small little word here. If you need to doctor something to make it look better, then you're on shaky ground. Let's continue on. We can see what the scriptures say with regards to using stones. It says in Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 9 through 12, it says, "When you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, do not imitate the detestable customs of those nations. No one among you is to sacrifice his son or daughter to the fire, practice divination, tell fortunes, interpret omens, practice sorcery," which is precisely what Joseph Smith did with regards to divination. He's using other sources outside of what the Lord has given to discern the will of God, and this will become more clear with regards to them using the rods later on. It says here in verse 12, it says, "Everyone who does these detestable acts to the Lord and the Lord your God is driving out the nations before you because of these detestable acts." So the Lord's saying, don't imitate these individuals. Don't scoop to their level, because the Lord will ultimately judge you. And this is what we see with regards to Joseph Smith doing. He's practicing divination to try to discern the will of the Lord instead of focusing on prayer and things of that nature. No, he's using a stone in order to receive the Lord's words for him and his people, which is honestly it's not advisable, and the Lord thinks it's detestable. We can also now look at what Jonathan Thomas says with regards to Joseph Smith's glass-looking trial. It says, "The prisoner was requested to look at the yeoman's for the chest of money. He did look, and pretended to know where it was, and that prisoner Thompson and the yeoman's went in search of it. That Smith arrived at the spot first. It was night, and Smith looked in the hat where they were, and when very dark, and told how the chest was situated. On account of the enchantment of the trunk, kept settling away from under them while digging, that notwithstanding that they continued constantly removing the dirt, yet the trunk kept about the same distance from them." This is, of course, the testimony of Jonathan Thompson. Like I said, so the individual says that Joseph Smith is using the stone in order to find the location of the treasure. Let's continue on. We can even see this with regards to some parallels or some reflection in the Book of Mormon. In Helaman 13:34-36, it says, "Behold, we lay a tool here, and on the marrow it is gone, and behold, our swords are taken from us. In that day we have sought them for battle, we have hid our treasure, and they have slipped away from us." Did you notice the parallel between the testimony of Jonathan Thompson saying that the treasure is slipping away from them, and the parallel here with regards to the hiding the treasure and it slipping away as well? That's not a coincidence, because it happens multiple times. "Because of the curses of the land, oh, that we had repented in the day that the word of the Lord came to us. For behold, the land is cursed, and all things are become slippery, and we cannot hold them." Let's continue on. We can see in Mormon 1:18, "And these Gideonites, robbers, who were among the Lamanites, did infest the land, insomuch that the inhabitants thereof began to hide up their treasure in the earth, and they became slippery." Once again, we can see the parallel between the testimony of Thompson and this passage here. It says, "Because the Lord had cursed the land, that they could not hold them nor retain them again." So once again, the wording is just too exact to be a coincidence. So we can see that Joseph Smith is relying on his experiences prior to becoming the prophet, and he's putting these reflections in the Book of Mormon. Let's continue on. We look at Helaman 12:18-19. It says, "And behold, if a man hide up treasure," once again, that's very the same language there. It says, "in the earth, and the Lord shall say, let it be accursed because of its iniquity of him who hath hid it up. Behold, it shall be accursed. And if the Lord shall say, Be thou accursed, that no man shall find thee from this time henceforth and forever, behold, no man getteth it henceforth and forever. Once again, we see the parallel of hiding up the treasure, and you can of course claim that they're taking it from the Lord Himself about hiding our treasure up in heaven, but that's not the case, because the affidavit with regards to how it is framed is just too exact with regards to what Smith is doing. So we can clearly see the parallel between Smith's previous life and his life as the prophet of the LDS Church. Now we can see that Joseph Smith has a desperate need in order to get rich. We can see it says in Paul Chessman's master's thesis, it says an analysis of the accounts relating to Joseph Smith's early visions. His master's thesis, 1965, page 130 and 131, it says, I immediately went up to the place and found where the plates was 21 deposited, and straightway made 3 attempts to get them. I cried unto the Lord in agony of my soul, Why can I not obtain them? And behold, the angel appeared unto me again and said, You cannot now obtain them, for the time is not yet fulfilled. I had been tempted of the adversary, and sought the plates to obtain riches. So here, instead of blaming his own greed, he's blaming the devil, and he's saying that I was tempted, so that's why I sinned, and that's why I'm greedy. Well, no, he won't take responsibility for his own sinful behavior. But let's continue on. It says, and kept not the commandment that I should have, and I singled to the glory of God. Therefore I was chastened and sought diligently to obtain the plates, and obtained them not until I was 21 years of age. So once again, I need to highlight the fact that instead of once again taking responsibility for his own sins, he says that the devil tempted me. Well, you're supposed to be the prophet, you're supposed to be the example for your people, and you won't even take responsibility for your own sinfulness. What kind of man of God are you, Joseph? Let's continue on. Now, this is interesting, because if you look at the Book of Commandments, which is the precursor to the Doctrine and Covenants, the 1833 edition, you will see, if you go to that website there, that the word, it mentions a gift of a rod. And you will not find that, of course, in the new updated Doctrine and Covenants. It says in chapter 8, verse 6 and 7, it says, Now this is not all the gift, for you have another gift, which is the gift of Aaron. Behold, it has told you many things. Behold, there is no other power save the power of God that can cause this gift of Aaron to be with you. So the important thing is to know that the rod, once again, is not in the new Doctrine and Covenants, but it's in the old Book of Commandments, and the Aaron is not in the old one either. So we can see, if you go there and look, you'll see that the LDS Church has actually doctored their text in order to push away suspicion with regards to Joseph Smith being in the the money hunting business, and being willing to use practices in order to obtain that, whether it's through the divining rods or the stone. Let's continue on. We can see with regards to the Restoration Scriptures on page 211 through 214, it says, Several writers have established that both in Vermont and in the western New York in the early 1800s, one of the many forms which enthusiastic religion took was the adaptation of the witch hazel stick. For example, the divining rod was used effectively by one Nathaniel Wood in Rutland County, Vermont in 1801. Wood, Winchell, William Cowdery Jr., and his son Oliver Cowdery. Those names should be familiar to the LDS, because those are prominent LDS figures. All had some knowledge of and associations with the various uses, both secular and sacred, of the forked witch hazel rod. Winchell and others used such a rod in seeking buried treasure. So the idea would be to, of course, use the stick or the rod to find the buried treasure. So that's once again, it highlights their greed and highlights the fact that they are money hungry. Let's continue on. It says, when Joseph Smith met Oliver Cowdery in April 1829, he found a man particularly adept to the use of the forked rod. He soon was Joseph's close friend and confidant, his scribe and trusted counselor. In the midst of such mutual repartee, and against the background of his own experiments with and uses of ocular media, Joseph Smith's April 29th affirmations about Cowdery's unnatural power related to the working with the rod are quite understandable. By the time that Joseph Smith approached the reinterpretation and rewording of the document for the 1835 edition of the Doctrine and Covenants, he had the time and experience necessary to place his 1829 assessment of the meaning of Cowdery's gift of working with the rod in something somewhat more accurate perspective. Both he and Cowdery had developed away from an emphasis on the religious or mystical meanings in such mechanical objects as the water witching rod. Joseph's 1835 wording of the document left behind the apparent 1829 reliance upon the external media, which by 1835 had assumed in Joseph's mind overtones of a superstition and speculative experimentation. So it's saying that Joseph Smith was a very superstitious man, and that the individuals within the church used the divining rod in order to find buried treasure, even as leaders in the church. Let's continue on. We can see here that Joseph Smith is preoccupied with his money, that he needs money, and that an individual has told him about money. It says, they had been preoccupied with paying their debts to the point of pursuing an unwise strategy. A brother in the church by the name of Burgess had come to Kirkland and stated that a large amount of money had been secreted in a cellar of a certain house in Salem, Massachusetts. We saw the brother Burgess, but Don Carlos Smith told us that with regards to the hidden treasure, his statement was credited by the brethren, and the steps were taken to try and secure the treasure, of which we will speak more fully in another place. So here, the individuals are told about the money, and they hatch a plan to go and get it. And this is unfortunate because Joseph Smith and the leaders of the LDS Church are part of this, which means that even after they become leaders in the church, they are greedy because they have a desire to go and get this money. We can see it also says, under these circumstances, Joseph Smith took a risk. A man named Jonathan Burgess had told him that there was a large amount of money buried in the cellar in the house in Salem, Massachusetts. He said he knew where it was and that he was the only living person who did. Joseph, his brother Hiram, Oliver Cowdery, and Sidney Rigdon set out for Salem in July, planning to meet Burgess and locate the house and hopefully find the treasure. They eventually found the house, but it was not for sale or rent, and they left Salem without getting access to it. So here they go all this way to Salem, and they didn't get the money. That's important because it ties into the Doctrine and Covenants as well. Specifically, chapter 111. It says that this was given in Salem, Massachusetts to Joseph Smith on August 6, 1836. And the important part is verse 2. It says, I have much treasure in the city for you. And see, the interesting thing about this whole passage here is if you read the passage in the original Doctrine and Covenants, that this passage has been changed quite a bit, because the original passage has a lot more to do with money, and it shows the greed that Joseph Smith has and how the Lord has promised him money, and it doesn't come to pass. Let's also look at verse 4. It says, and it shall come to pass in due time that I will give the city into your hands, that you shall have power over it, insomuch that they shall not discover your secret parts, and its wealth pertaining to gold and silver shall be yours. So here we can see once again that the Lord has promised gold and silver, and yet they went all the way to the house and they didn't get the money that they thought they were going to get. But it also says in verse 5, it says, concern not yourself about your debts, for I will give your power to pay them, for there are more treasure than one for you in the city. So here they're trying to put a spiritual spin on it, but ultimately this is all about him trying to get money to pay his debts. And he went all the way to get the money, and yet he didn't get the money. So therefore, how can he pay his debts if he didn't have the money? Which once again shows that Joseph Smith really, he only thought about money, and he thought about trying to better himself. And so with all that being said, with Joseph Smith having his seer stone and the divining rods, and relying on occultic practices to try to divine the will of the Lord, we can clearly see that he is a false prophet and should not be trusted. And additionally, we understand that honestly, Mormonism is built upon a foundation of sand, and eventually it will come crumbling down But before that happens, I want you to get out, and I want you to come to the real ark of safety, which is the Lord Jesus Christ, who loves you and cares for you and wants you to save. He wants to save your soul. So that's what I want to leave you with. The Lord wants to save you. The question is, are you going to investigate this stuff for yourselves, or are you going to bury your head in the sand and just follow blindly with what your leaders say to do? I know you're very intelligent, so I would invite you to investigate these things for yourself and check the claims of the LDS Church and see that they are wanting in the scales of the Lord, and they will ultimately be judged. But like I said, before that, I want you to get out, and I want you to come and know the true and living Christ.